Welcome to the Modern Husbands Podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Kristen Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money and the home as a team. Today, we welcome Leah Hadley, founder of Intentional Divorce Solutions and Intentional Wealth Partners. Leah is the author of When It's Just Not Working, a practical divorce guide for stay-at-home moms. Leah is an accredited financial counselor, certified divorce financial analyst, master analyst in financial forensics, and collaboratively trained financial neutral. On today's episode, Leah shares why divorce rates are so high and steps spouses can take to avoid a path toward divorce. More specifically, Leah will share certain problems that have built up beyond repair that could have been prevented early on, and some of the most common complaints women have that spouses can address early in a marriage. Enjoy the show.
So thank you, Leah, for being on our podcast. We're so excited to have you here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's just jump right into it. You're a certified divorce financial analyst. What is that?
It's a great question. A lot of people are not familiar with the designation, but it is somebody who is educated specifically on the complexities of finances as it relates to divorce. So really looking at the divorce process through that financial planning lens, really understanding the financial analysis that goes into the process. And so that way we can really serve our clients who are struggling with those financial questions going through that divorce.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a little bit more complex than, the normal route for going through the financial planning process with couples that are together.
Absolutely. I think of it as kind of financial planning on steroids.
I like that. That's good.
So when we reached out to you, we were thrilled that you said yes, because we look at what you do and your experience and all of your credentialing, and our thought is, wow, if there's somebody out there that really understands what causes divorce, it would be you. And so for this podcast episode, what we're doing is we're looking at it through the lens of somebody who has that level of expertise in this area. So you can share with listeners the steps they can take to avoid it, how to, kind of nip it in the bud in the early stages. So that's just as context for the listeners. And, kind of with that said, do you work with one spouse going through a divorce, or do you actually work with both spouses?
So in an ideal world, Brian, I work with both spouses, but more often than not, I work with one spouse. So when I'm working with one spouse, I'm hired as a financial advocate. And when I'm working with both spouses, I'm hired as a financial neutral. And why I say in an ideal world, I'm hired as a neutral is because I can make the biggest impact on terms of helping both parties really set themselves up for a successful financial future if I have the opportunity to really engage with both parties, understand what their goals are, what their concerns are, and really come to a solution that ultimately addresses those things for both parties. We can also save them the most amount of money, not just in terms of the divorce process, but when you're dividing assets, there are a lot of tax implications and administrative expenses that people just don't think about. And being able to really look at it from how can we optimize the marital estate for both parties just makes that whole division much more efficient and cost effective. But vast majority of the time, once people are to that point, they're not necessarily looking at the divorce as this puzzle that they want to solve together. Instead, most people are looking at it as sort of a game of chess, right? Like what's the strategy and kind of, really me versus them. And so, that's why we are more frequently hired as a financial advocate. But with that being said, it doesn't have to be that way. And we see a lot of success in working as a neutral with folks.
All right. So let's say that the spouses go into it telling you and telling each other, let's go through this together and make sure the process is smooth. But one of them's trying to play chess. Have you ever had one of them kind of bring you to the side and be like, hey, I got a few $1,000s that are kind of like rolled up in this rubber band right here. If you maybe give me, give me a little bit extra. Have you ever had anybody try to bribe you in the process?
I've never had anybody try to bribe me, but
Really?
I certainly have had lots of people who, maybe they really just want to get through the process quickly, or they're very concerned about their children and they want to do what people refer to as an amicable divorce, but they might not be mentally and emotionally ready yet to really be able to engage in a process in that way. And so sometimes we do get started with couples where we really look at them and they're not on the same page as far as, where they're processing, divorce. People go through a whole grieving process, and where they are emotionally, are they able to make decisions at this point in time or not? But we always go, when we're working with both parties, as slow as the slowest person, and so that allows that person to really catch up in terms of processing and that sort of thing. But do people say to me, hey, I don't want my spouse to know about this? Yes. And if I'm working as a neutral, they will know. So if I'm working as an advocate, it's a different experience, but everything is on the table when I'm working as a neutral.
Well, for our listeners, I don't want you to think that I would think of a question like that. Just Bruce wrote it down. I just took his question.
I am curious. So you said so the majority of the clients that you see are just individuals. What's the difference for those that come to you as couples? Do you see? Is there a noticeable difference in the type of couple or the type of person that comes in that wants to be seen together still?
Yeah, the people who are wanting to come in and work through the process together, in a lot of cases, they really are very committed parents that are really prioritizing their children's well-being. And so they want to make sure that they go through a process that allows the children to continue to have good, positive relationships with both parents, and that they don't end their marriage in such a way that there's so much conflict that it makes it very difficult to have a co-parenting relationship after the fact. The other big segment of folks that we see coming through the neutral process are people who are older. So I don't know if you're familiar with the term gray divorce, but the highest divorce rates are actually, the older folks whose kids are out of the house and maybe college or early adulthood. And they are really concerned at this point, maybe they're retired or near retirement, that the divorce is going to derail their ability to retire and they could run out of money. And so they're really looking at it as a financial problem that needs to be solved and making sure that both of them are going to be okay. As far as the advocacy goes, that often, especially in my practice, a lot of times the person that I'm working with has a tremendous amount of fear around their financial future. Maybe they weren't involved in the finances during the marriage, and now they're going to have to be responsible on their own. There's a lot of distrust in the divorce process in general. There are a lot of issues that lead up to divorce. And so, feeling like they have somebody who can look through the financials and confidently make those decisions can just be critical in getting through that process. Sometimes people are just stuck in the process because they can't make decisions because they just don't know.
So from what you have seen, why do you believe divorce rates are so high right now?
It's a good question. I see all kinds of things in my practice. There are folks who have been unhappy in their marriage for a long time. Maybe there's been a lot of infidelity in the marriage, but they were willing in some cases to make things work while their kids were growing up. And then once their kids are grown up, then they're ready to terminate the marriage. Communication is a huge issue. I will say that those folks who really invest in their communication skills during the marriage are much more likely to have a reasonable divorce experience, right? Like they've developed those skills. They know how to communicate with one another and they're able to solve problems together. That's just such a stronger foundation in order to enter the divorce process, right? But a lot of folks just communication has broken down over the years. For some people, they're more committed to parenting than they are to their marriage. They haven't prioritized their marriage. But we see, unfortunately, a lot of cases where there's some level of abuse in the marriage, either, emotional abuse, financial abuse is a big one that I help people to work through coming out of marriage. So there's really a variety of different reasons. For the older folks, where we really see the highest rates of divorce, for a lot of them, it was just absolutely not socially acceptable when they would have maybe wanted to get a divorce years and years ago, right? And so now the fact that, the world has changed, maybe, their parents have passed on and they feel like they can make that decision now. There's a lot of reasons why we see it happening in the older population.
Have you noticed a trend of particular problems that have built up kind of beyond repair that could have been prevented early on? If so, what are they?
Well, so I really focus my practice around the financial issues, of course. And so a lot of what I'm seeing is, and it's not necessarily that anybody is doing anything wrong, but one person is taking responsibility for the finances and not necessarily communicating those things with the other partner, right? And so over the years, it becomes like very siloed, in which case one of the partners just doesn't have any concept of their financial situation at all. And so then when they start to be sort of educated by their spouse, if you will, they don't trust the information that they're getting. They're worried that their spouse has been keeping something, especially if infidelity is coming up in other ways in the marriage. Suddenly, it translates. When people think about their finances, they're thinking about their security. Like, am I going to be okay? Right. And so when there's this lost trust around other issues, it suddenly creates a lot of fear around, am I going to be okay financially? Can I trust this person who I've delegated all of this to and allowed them to take care of? And in a lot of cases, Brian, they're not necessarily doing the best job. And it's not because they're doing something malicious, although, there are cases, but a lot of them just truly don't know any better. And maybe then they get to a point of they're hiding things from their spouse because they're embarrassed that they haven't done a good job. I mean, we see all kinds of things.
Oh my gosh, I'm thinking through what it must be like to be a couple where there's other issues going on, and as a result, either one spouse feels like they could be left, or maybe there's been infidelity, or they don't trust him, whatever. And then based on what you're telling me, like this siloed experience, most of us, have a certain amount of fear. If now all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, I might be on my own, and you don't know anything about your personal financial situation, I can see how that would very quickly snowball. Probably, I would think, unnecessarily at times. Is that the case? I mean, could some of this have been prevented by just simply having conversations on a regular basis about money?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are so many times where I will hear from somebody, they're so afraid that their spouse is hiding money. And when I go through all of the information, all I can see is that they're spending beyond their means and that there is debt and there's a reason why there's debt, right? And that, no, there isn't some other stock of cash anywhere. You guys have been consistently spending beyond your means, right? Now, obviously, there are cases where, yes, somebody is hiding money. Absolutely, it happens. But more often than not, it's just getting educated around your financial situation. So many times I see one spouse make a financial proposal to the other, and it's actually a very reasonable offer, and the other just completely shuts it down because they just feel like they can't trust that person. They have no idea if it's fair. They have no idea, what it even translates into in terms of lifestyle post-divorce. And so absolutely just staying on the same page with your financials. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're both actively engaged in paying the bills or making the investment decisions. Maybe one of you is more confident in that realm, but it is making sure that you're both staying on the same page, talking about your goals, making decisions about how you're going to allocate funds. So that way you are working toward the same financial goals.
See, what you're telling me makes a heck of a lot of sense. And for me, it's like a light bulb has gone off, because what the research says and surveys have said is that money is a leading cause of divorce and stress in a marriage, depending on the survey, depending on the year. It's always way, way up there.
It's always in the top 3 at least.
Yeah. And I've always been a little skeptical, because my thought is, well, if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you can't avoid it, you're naturally living in a state of stress. And so is it really a lack of understanding of money, or is it the fact that you just don't have enough? Or maybe you have a lot of kids and now there's medical problems, whatever it may be. So part of me thinks, man, this could be a little bit of a misnomer. But what you're telling me now makes so much more sense that if there's other things that are also going on and one person has no clue what's going on with the personal finances, now when there is a major disruption in their marriage, there's no trust around money. And I can
Right.
see how it would quickly spiral. And just having money conversations can at least prevent people from having unnecessary fights and fears.
There's another element to it too, though, Brian. We are all raised differently as it relates to communicating about money, as it relates to our level of financial literacy, how we relate to just dealing with money. And for some people, they bring a lot of baggage into the marriage around finances. And I'll use a personal example. My ex-husband and I were married for 10 years. He grew up in Peru. It's in a very impoverished area. And so he was always had this tremendous amount of fear around money. Whereas I'm somebody who, grew up in a suburb in Ohio, well educated, know how to increase my income. I feel very strongly that I have that capability to do that, and never felt that same sense of worry that he felt. Well, you could see how there would be a natural conflict with somebody who, is growing their income and wanting to enjoy the fruits of their labor, and somebody who's very fearful around spending, right? And I never fully appreciated that while we were married because we were in the thick of it. But just our own experience growing up created a tremendous amount of tension around money. And having those conversations, and I often encourage people early on, people are so worried to talk to somebody they're dating about money at all because it's this taboo conversation. But you don't have to ask them how much they make. You don't have to ask them how much they have or what their credit score is. But how did you grow up talking about money? Was it something you talked about in your house, or is it something that you didn't talk about in your house? Is it a comfortable conversation for you or not a comfortable conversation? That can be a very soft place to open up dialogue around money and get to know where that other person is coming from. So then in the future, if something comes up and you're like, why is that person giving me such a hard time about spending when I earned that money? Okay, I get where it's coming from, but we need to be able to communicate about these things so we can come to some kind of mutual understanding about how we're going to handle money together.
Hey there, podcast fam. We'd love to hear from you. Please take this moment to rate and subscribe to our podcast. Your feedback fuels our passion to bring you more engaging content. And please text this episode to your friends. It's your support that can help us grow. Now back to the show.
So I have this question. I know you're working through the finances with these individuals, with these couples, but how much of your practice is actually focused on the finances versus actual counseling behaviors? Because we're talking about emotional regulation, all the stress that it brings into the session, communication issues. How much is it counseling versus straight finances in your practice?
Bruce, I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, I feel like you're my therapist.
Right?
But we do. We talk.
I know you're very compassionate. I know you care a lot. So, and I get that sense from you. So I'm wondering, yeah.
Yeah. But we've actually really built out the practice to support that as well. So we do have a divorce coach on the team, and she runs divorce support groups for us, because I am a true believer that if you want to divorce with intentionality, you really have to take care of your mental health, and you really have to build up those communication skills in order to get through that process. So she's a phenomenal resource for our clients and helping them with that.
How much do you stay on the counseling versus the financial side?
I do recognize that I am not a therapist. I am an accredited financial counselor. So I do have a little bit of background in terms of the financial counseling, but I'm definitely not a therapist. I very much encourage people, if they're struggling emotionally, to reach out to a therapist, depending on what their needs are. Sometimes a divorce coach is more appropriate, but my focus is really on the finances.
And for our listeners, if you go to the Financial Therapy Association website, they have a directory there of financial therapists. Dr. Ross is financial therapist. I don't know if he's practicing anymore. If he is, I don't know how he finds the time. But it is. I'm glad that you brought that up, Leah, because it is of particular importance for people who have some pretty deep-seated issues that are based on things that happen in their childhood. There could be, financial trauma, whatever it may be. And you can't work through some of these problems, surfing Google, they require
Right.
a different level of expertise. And if you love your spouse, your marriage deserves it. Your marriage deserves
Right.
that investment.
I know we've talked a lot about kind of the complaints now that partners bring in. The lack of communication about finances, the lack of maybe even just financial literacy sometimes, or how the home finances work. So is there any advice that you would give couples, that are early on in their marriage before they get to this divorce point? Hopefully, so they don't get to this divorce point.
Absolutely. And I will say, I think it's important to recognize that divorce is not a failure. For a lot of people, it's actually in their best interest. It's not that I'm pro divorce, but I am pro making the divorce process as easy as possible on families and making sure that people are prepared so that they are financially secure for their future. And so, really going into the relationship, understanding what you're expecting from one another. Sometimes we have these ideas in our minds, but we don't necessarily communicate that to our partner. And so when they are disappointing you or not meeting your expectations, suddenly it becomes, maybe resentful or something over time. Whereas that person may have no idea that you expected that from them. And that's where that communication really early on is so important. But it's not just early on. And I think a lot of times people will make more of an effort early on. But, we work with people who have been married 10, 20, 30 plus years through the divorce process. And so it's not necessarily something that was going on early on, but over time. And so over time, it's important to continue to recommit to your marriage every day, even when you're parents. A lot of times when people have children, they are so committed to being fantastic parents. And I see it all the time, both parents actively involved in their children's lives, but not actively engaging with one another. And so then when their kids grow up, suddenly they're looking at each other and they don't necessarily have a relationship between each other anymore. And it's like, and it's all those years of really focusing and prioritizing the kids over and above everything else. And so, continuing to commit to the marriage over and over and over again over the years, acknowledging that people are going to grow and change. So many people get married very, very young. My first marriage, I got married very, very young. And if you're married that young, you're still getting to know yourself, right, through that time period. And so certainly, you're getting to know this other person, you're getting to know yourself. Things are going to adapt and change. Then you bring kids into the mix for a lot of folks. And so really recognizing that and talking about it, talking about your goals together and how they might change and evolve. We do financial planning for couples as well. We do a lot more for couples who are in their second marriages. And what I see for those who are in their second marriages is they recognize some of those problems that happened in the first marriage and are incredibly proactive in making sure that, okay, this time around, we are going to talk about the financial planning. We're going to stay on the same page as it relates to the finances. And that is really critical in that open communication and trust. Again, it really does build trust when you're both on the same page. You're talking about these things, even when they're difficult. And I put out a post last year on social media that got a lot of feedback. But what I said was, when people lose their jobs, it's so hard on them personally, but it's also very hard on their family. And what if you use that challenging time as an opportunity to really problem solve together and to grow closer rather than to kind of hide behind closed doors and not have those conversations because maybe you're feeling shame around the job loss, right? When we have these things come up, major medical bills, things that weren't planned, using them as an opportunity to really work together instead of having those moments create conflict that then spirals out of control over time.
Have you ever seen the movie What Women Want with Mel Gibson?
I have.
Okay. So I watched that movie. I don't know when it was. It was a long time ago. Let's say it was 15, 20 years ago. And it was a little bit terrifying because it's like you're watching this. And for the listeners who haven't seen it, Mel Gibson decides that, he's going to take a bath and something falls into the bathtub. He's electrocuted. And now he can actually hear the thoughts of the women around him. And he's this, he's a dog, right? And he always thought women loved him. And he's walking around and he's hearing their thoughts and he realizes, oh my goodness, these women hate my guts. And so you're going to be our mind reader for our listeners. We want to know what women are thinking right now. So in your experience, help our listeners, kind of take that role of understanding what it is that they might have said to you that they didn't say to their spouse, or maybe they're saying to their spouse too late. It could be simple things. One, they just never helped around the house, or they weren't good caregivers, whatever it may be. But what is it that women are thinking that they're not saying to husbands, where husbands can at least think to themselves, ooh, I need to be proactive here. I need to perhaps address this, even though she's not saying anything.
Oh, I hear so much. Honestly, a lot does have to do with division of labor in the home. A lot of people are not communicating about their resentment around, having to take on more of the share of household responsibilities. That comes up a lot. If your partner is delegating all of the financial responsibilities to you, it's probably because they feel like you are much more capable or able of handling those things. That's not an area where they feel confident. However, I would push back and really encourage and invite them into that conversation, because even if you never go through a divorce, and hopefully you don't, but somebody's going to pass on at some time, or somebody's going to become incapacitated, or there are a lot of reasons why people have to take ownership and responsibility of their finances. And that's terrifying for somebody who doesn't know anything about it. And so, like I said, a lot of people who are just not comfortable in that realm just automatically, naturally, and gratefully have the other person take over that responsibility. But what I hear is the fear on the other side of that. And that, like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do this. And, all of this on the other side. And it goes both ways. So gentlemen who are listening, and maybe your wife takes on more of the financial responsibility, it goes both ways. So I deal with lots of men who are very scared on the other side of, how am I going to handle this? My wife has handled it over the years. So it definitely goes both ways. But, so much of it really comes down to those expectations we have for each other and not communicating those. And then the person just is not meeting them because they don't know the expectation to begin with.
I got it. I go back to Dr. Kate Mongino. She was a past podcast guest, and she wrote the book Equal Partners. And we asked her for, some simple advice. And there was this just one profound thing she said where I thought, oh my goodness, if I could go back in time and change one thing, would be just to ask this question, to ask your spouse, what does an ideal spouse look like to you? And then have them ask you. Like, I never thought of asking my wife, what does an ideal husband look like to you? So at least I have a vision of what success looks like in her eyes. So anyhow, where can folks learn more about you?
I am all over social media. Please come follow me, join me. On LinkedIn, I'm active, and my name on LinkedIn is Leah A. Hadley. On Instagram, it's Intentional Divorce Solutions.
And for those that unfortunately might be considering divorce, thinking about divorce, at what point should they look into contacting a certified divorce financial analyst?
It's a great question. The sooner, the better. I always encourage people to reach out to a CDFA even before they reach out to an attorney, because that way you can really get your financial ducks in a row. There are people who reach out to us years before they decide to proceed with a divorce. Maybe they need to pay off some debt in order to get into a situation where they're going to be more comfortable, going through the divorce process, that kind of a thing. But really getting things in order before you get into the process. And that CDFA can really help you to find legal counsel who's going to be a good fit for your case. So oftentimes people literally will just call, the first attorney they see on Google, or, whoever their friend or neighbor used, or what have you. But I will tell you what, when somebody asks me for an attorney referral, I ask them a lot of questions before I give them a referral, because attorneys are individuals and each practice is unique. So I really encourage people to reach out to a CDFA as soon as they're thinking they're going to terminate the marriage.
So yeah, even years in advance.
Sometimes it makes sense.
Great. So we always like to leave our listeners with one little piece of actionable advice. So if you could have one piece of actionable advice, what would it be?
To involve your spouse in communicating around your finances. So if you're talking to your accountant at tax season, you're talking to your accountant together. You are both looking at your tax returns before signing them. And if you don't understand what they say, talk to your accountant, talk to a financial coach, make sure you understand the tax return before you sign it. Financial advisor meetings. Both, even if you don't know everything that's going on, you don't understand everything, make sure that both spouses are attending, and then individually together having regular financial conversations.
A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach. And join your fellow modern husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every 2 weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.